Good. Yes, recording.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So last week we spoke about names. Let's talk tonight a little bit about dates. We have in the Parashat Bo, famous pasuk, Hachodesh hazeh lachem, Rosh Chodashim, Rishon lachem lechodshei hashana, the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. Of course, everybody remembers Rashi, the first Rashi on the Torah, that says this should have been the beginning. This should have been where the Torah began. Why do we need all of Sefer Bereshit? Why do we need the rest of Shmot? Until now, this is the first mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, the first mitzvah we are given as a nation. The Torah is a book of telling us what to do, how to behave, and all the stories that come before we could have known in other ways. We could have begun with Hachodesh hazeh lachem. And Rashi says the famous answer from the first pasuk. There's koach ma'asav yigid le'amor letet lehem nachalat goyim. If in any point, hypothetically, theoretically, there might be a situation where the nations of the world will come and say, this isn't your land, you don't belong here. Imagine how such a thing could happen. But if it were to happen, so it would say, right, it's Hashem koach ma'asav yigid le'amor. God, it's his land. He decides who to give it to, who to take it away from. We spoke about this a while ago, and I pointed out the fact that it says koach ma'asav yigid le'amor. The limud over here is before we tell whether the nations of the world right now, they're arguing with us about other psukim in the Torah, about what they mean and whether, how to interpret those. But it's not necessarily for them, it's for us. But in any event, that's the Rashi. But that's how we have the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, of the new moon. And it's talking, of course, this is in Chodesh Nisan. This is on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And the Ramban learns out from this pasuk. He says that this is there's a mitzvah, there's an obligation that the Torah is telling us here. Rishonu lachem lechodshei hashana. When you count the months of the year, you count your calendar, you have to begin with Nisan. You have to count according to this. And this is the way, of course, that the Torah counts the months. We have all the names, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, those come much, much later. The Ramban explains. Those are names which they only brought back with them after they came back from Bava. But before that, in the Torah, certainly in the Chumash, those names don't exist. The names are Chodesh HaRishon, Chodesh HaSheni, Chodesh HaShvi'i. It's the number of the months. Later on, we do find other places in Tanakh, Sefer Melachim, for example. So there are certain months which have names, Chodesh Ziv, Yerachai Tanim. There are names which are mentioned there. Of course, in Megillat Esther is where we do find the names that we have now. But what's interesting there, if you look in Megillat Esther, every time when it mentions the names of the month, it also mentions the numbers. Chodesh Shnei Masar or Chodesh Adar. So we're still counting according to Chodesh Nisan. By the way, the Gra has a brilliant insight on this pasuk. He says over here, there's also a remez. There's a hint to the halacha that we don't fast in Chodesh Nisan. And where do we see that? It says the Chodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. Just as the same way you don't fast on Rosh Chodesh. You don't fast. The month of Nisan is an entire month of Rosh Chodesh for you, in the sense that you don't fast on Rosh Chodesh on this month. You don't fast as well. Okay. So says the Ramban. Let me read to you his language. It says in his Perush on Chumash that this is a mitzvah. He says, Tam Hachodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim sheyimnu oto Yisrael Chodesh HaRishon. We need to count this as our first month is Nisan. Umimenu yimnu kol hachodashim, and you will count all the other months from that. V'sheni, v'shlishi, at tashlum hashana b'shneim asar chodesh. Because nowadays it's very common. You talk in modern Hebrew, you're talking about a date. So you say chodesh hashvi'i, chodesh hashvi'i. People are talking about July, September. They're not necessarily talking about these months. And he has the question, according to the Ramban, that would seem to be very problematic. Kadei sheyeh zeh zikaron b'nei sagadol. Says, so why do we have to count our months based on Nisan? It's a zikaron lanes. We are remembering what took place in Nisan, which is of course Yetziat Mitzrayim. Ki b'chol et shenaskir al chodashim yiyeh hanes nizkar. At any point where you mention the months, you mention the date, the calendar, which we do all the time. So there will be another way of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. V'alken en hachodashim shem b'Torah. Therefore, in the Torah, the months don't have a name. Ela yamar b'chodesh hashlishi. ואומר ויהי בשנה השנית בחודש השני, בחודש השביעי. etc. V'chein kulam. So that's the Ramban. There's actually a long, very long Ramban at the end of the parasha. At the end of Parashat Bo, he discusses this idea again, how we have so many mitzvot that are related to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Many obvious ones, which you would think are that we know, things Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim and Kiddush every Friday night, and you have Pesach and Kriyat Shema, etc. There are other ones as well which are less obvious, but he says we have it's such a central tenet of our faith. He explains, he elaborates at great length over there, the Ramban, as to why it is we need to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Ritva, he says it doesn't have a commentary on Chumash, but he says in the Gemara, beginning on Masechet Rosh Hashanah, he compares this to the same way when we count the days of the week. The same way we count the days of the week according to Shabbat. In Hebrew, the days of the week don't have a name, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. It's the same idea, counting according to that which we want to remember. So let me show you. So the Ritva, he says it like this. He says, we don't have names for the days of the week. He says, whenever we say the day of the week, we are remembering according to Shabbat. Yom Yom Rishon l'Shabbat, Yom Yom Sheni l'Shabbat. All the time there is a constant mitzvah to remember Shabbat, to remember the creation in that way. And he says in the same way, in a similar way, etc. The same way we don't have names for the days of the week in order to remember Shabbat, so we don't have days for the months in order to remember Nisan, to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. והטעם כדי שנזכור תמיד יציאת מצרים, וזהו שאמרו בראשית רבה, שמות החודשים עלו מבבל. So initially, we only had the numbers, right, counting from Nisan. It says when they came back from Bavel, so they brought the names with them as well. So how does that work? Says the Ritva, פירוש, שלא תמצא שמות ניסן, אייר וחבריו נזכרים בכתוב, אלא אחר שירדו לבבל. We only find these names appearing in the Tanakh after the Galut Bavel. ושמות פרסים הם, these are Persian names, אפילו אחי לעולם מייחס אותם ליציאת מצרים. And even then, we still connect the names to יציאת מצרים. בחודש הראשון, וחודש ניסן, ו12 וחודש אדר, as we mentioned, as we find in Megillat Esther. So it would seem to be that when one is counting, there's even a discussion here, if you're using the Hebrew names, which are actually maybe Persian names or whatever, there's discussion whether you have to say the number of the month each time. It would be incredibly tedious if we had to do that. Every time we said Chodesh Iyar or Chodesh Hasheni or Chodesh Hashlishi, whatever it is. The Mai say we don't do that. But the question is, okay, so we're counting the months, we have to count to Nisan. What happens when you start counting to January or to September or to whatever it is? Can you use those dates? And if you can, why is it? The fact is, we see throughout the generations that many people have used these dates, and many great people have used the secular dates. Rav Ovadia has a tshuva. It's very interesting. I think it's in Yabia Omer, where he talks about using the secular calendar. So he has a few different parts to it. Discusses about months, about years, which is a separate question. But one of his proofs that it would be allowed is he quotes, presumably by memory, by heart, he quotes a number of tshuvot of the Khatam Sofer, and there are other achronim, where in the tshuva, it has the date. The date appears, the secular date or whatever day of the month. You remembered from, these are the things, the introduction, the line, most people don't pay attention to. Ovadia, with his encyclopedic knowledge and his memory, knew where all these places were. And he goes through the tshuva. There's a whole section of the tshuva. He just goes through quoting different tshuvot, which list the dates. So one of them is the Khatam Sofer, which is surprising and it's interesting. The Khatam Sofer, really, last time when we spoke about names, we mentioned Khatam Sofer and Maram Shik. So the Khatam Sofer, based on this Ramban, he actually writes, he says you should not use the secular dates, the non-Jewish names of the months. He says he writes very, very strongly against that in a couple of places. His Talmud, the Maram Shik, writes very strongly as well not to use the secular dates for a different reason. Khatam Sofer talks about the months. He's not so happy about the count of the years because he says it's connected to associations of Avodah Zarah, etc. That's a separate question. But in terms of the months, so can you use the months? Can we say Chodesh HaRishon, Chodesh HaSheni, etc. when it's not actually referring to Nisan, but then it's referring to January, February, etc. So the first thing to note is that although the Ramban brings this, and this is the pshat of Rashi, many of the other Rishonim do not bring this. It doesn't appear in the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvot that you have to count the months according to Nisan. Many Rishonim understand the Pashtut. When the Torah says Hachodesh hazeh Rishon Chodshei Shana, when we're counting the months in terms of when the Torah tells us Chodesh HaShvi'i or whatever it is for the we have in Zechariah, we have regarding the fast, Tzom HaRavi'i, Tzom HaChamishi, in order to count, in order to know which are the months. That count is based on Nisan is the first, and that's how we know when the Moadot are. But if there are other systems of counting or other systems that are used for convenience, is there a prohibition not to use that? So again, according to the Ramban, it seems yes, we have to stay this way. But according to the Rambam, according to a number of other Rishonim, it's not. That's not going to be a problem, and one could use them. Rosh Weiss has an interesting insight here as well. It says even if we go according to the Ramban, and we say that when you're counting the months, you have to count the months only according from Nisan. But he says, how do we define what is a month? Right, a month, based on the word moon, is the lunar cycle. So we know in our calendar, the month is 30 days or 29 days based on the cycle of the moon. But if you have an arbitrary allocation, sometimes it's 28 days, sometimes 29, sometimes 30, sometimes 31. It's got nothing to do with the lunar cycle. It just happens to be. It was originally maybe, but it's something arbitrary. If we decided to divide the year up into weeks, or you decided to divide the year up into quarters, and you counted that way for convenience, would that be a problem in terms of counting the months? He says no. So it happens to be that we call them months, January, February. When we get to February, you see it makes no sense. 30, 31, 28, 29, as it comes out. But he says that's not a month. When the Torah said month, it's talking about the calendar that we have based on the lunar cycle, and therefore it's just an arbitrary way of dividing it up. That would not be the prohibition. Because even according to the Ramban, that would be okay to use those dates. He also says that if it's just for the sake of convenience, it's not about what's the idea when we say Rosh Chodesh Lishonu lachem Chodshei Shana, Rosh Chodashim. It's about giving it importance. It's about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. When we count, when we think about how the year starts and what do we remember, we want to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. But if there's another way of just for convenience of writing on a document or being able to know something, then he says that would be okay. And there is no prohibition as such. He says obviously it's better. One can go and one can use the Hebrew calendar and use those months. That's a better way of looking at it. But if for convenience sake, and the business purposes and the like, one uses the ordinary calendar, then that is okay, and that would be permitted. Today, by the way, it's much easier in terms of convenience as well. You get on the apps, on the calendars. Google Calendar actually allows you to add on, and next to the date, you can have all the Hebrew dates. You have the months there. It's much easier to count it in. In any event, Rabbi Kenigsberg ben Akash Omer, Hakadosh Baruch Hu lezakot Yisrael, v'chach b'alem Torah mitzvot, shnei adonai chafetz zman tzidko yagdir Torah v'yadir. Amen. Amen.